A research crew went out to film feeding whales in a routine Kaplan season in the North Atlantic. Nothing out of the ordinary, just standard survey conditions. But within a few hours, the ocean started behaving in a way no one on board could immediately explain. The whales weren't just following prey anymore. They were holding positions that didn't exist on any map. The sea had been ordinary that morning in the way only open water can be ordinary, meaning it looked like nothing in particular and refused to explain itself any further. The research vessel sat in it without resistance, engines reduced to a slow drift so the noise wouldn't interfere with the hydrophones already lowered into the water. Everyone on board was waiting for the same thing they had come for: feeding whales following Kaplan runs through a corridor that had been studied for years and mapped almost to the point of boredom. Kaplan had already been confirmed in dense patches beneath the surface. Sonar returned clean clusters moving in familiar seasonal patterns, compact shoals that rose and fell with temperature shifts. This was not supposed to be unusual. The North Atlantic does every year, and every year, whales arrive on schedule to take advantage of it. The first whale broke the surface farther out than the usual viewing range. It was a fin whale, long and deliberate in its movement, surfacing just enough to expose its back before slipping under again without drama. Then another appeared closer to the vessel, and then a third, and the pattern began to shift in a way that no one initially named. It wasn't that there were more whales than expected. It was the spacing between them that felt wrong. Not random, not chaotic, but held in place in a way that suggested something steady underneath the movement. Fin whales usually scatter when feeding, breaking into independent arcs as they track prey density. Here, they were not scattering. They were holding a distance from each other with a consistency that didn't match their feeding behavior. Dr. Luna Mills noticed it early, standing near the forward observation console where the acoustic feed was displayed in layered grayscale bands. She had been brought in after a preliminary sweep flagged non-standard clustering behavior, which was the kind of phrase that usually meant statistical noise. She had expected noise. What she was seeing was not noise. Capillin density was still the primary explanation on paper. The shoals were thick enough to justify a heavy whale presence. But the whales were not behaving like predators in a feeding zone. They were moving as if the feeding zone itself had a structure that extended beyond prey distribution, as if the water had invisible boundaries that were being respected. When the drones were launched, the view from above changed everything without immediately explaining anything. The ocean surface looked almost flat at first, broken only by faint ripples that stretched in long, uneven streaks. Only when the camera adjusted its angle did those streaks resolve into something more coherent. The water was not uniform. It had long, subtle lanes where surface tension and movement differed slightly from surrounding areas. Within those lanes, whale surfacing events began to cluster. They weren't evenly distributed. They weren't random. They appeared at intervals that repeated across space in a way that made it difficult to dismiss as a coincidence. One of the drone operators said it looked like invisible highways, then stopped talking after that because no one responded, and the comparison felt more accurate than anyone was comfortable admitting. Kaplan shoals were present in those same lanes, but their presence did not fully explain the structure. Prey usually drives whale movement into loose association. Here, the whales were maintaining positional consistency even when prey density shifted inside the lanes. It was as if the whales were responding to something broader than the fish themselves. By late morning, Mills requested archived data from previous seasons in the same corridor. 8 years of tagging information, hydrophone logs, satellite overlays. The patterns all showed variation, sometimes significant variation depending on water temperature and seasonal timing. None of them showed stability like this. Nothing held spatial consistency across species and time in the way this was holding. A second vessel arrived later in the day, smaller and less formal, operating under a mixed research authorization that covered multiple North Atlantic monitoring programs. Its presence wasn't unusual in itself, but the timing was. Dr. Mills boarded briefly to compare data sets and found the same issue reflected there. Independent instruments were converging on the same spatial anomalies without agreeing on a physical cause. Hydrophone data was reprocessed with tighter filters. The expectation was that the structure would collapse under noise reduction. It didn't. Whale vocalizations remained low frequency and typical for feeding behavior, but the spacing between calls formed repeating intervals that held steady across time windows. Not rhythmic in any musical sense, but structured enough that randomness could no longer explain it. By afternoon, the sea had gone still in a way that felt unnatural, even for open water. Wind dropped, surface motion slowed, and drone footage became clearer. From above, the lanes in the water were easier to see now, stretching longer across the surface, intersecting at shallow angles, forming patterns that looked less like biological distribution and more like a framework that had always been there, but was only now being noticed. Whales surfaced along those same structures, not all at once, not in synchronized bursts, but in staggered sequences that maintained spacing across kilometers of water. The most unsettling part was that nothing seemed to be coordinating them in any obvious way. No spike in communication, no identifiable signal chain, nothing that suggested conscious alignment. And yet alignment was exactly what was happening. By evening, even the technicians who had been skeptical stopped trying to reduce it into familiar terms. The whales were not competing for prey in the usual way. There were overlapping feeding zones with no displacement events. Multiple species were present in the same areas without triggering the typical avoidance or dominance behaviors. Fin whales, humpbacks, and occasional minkies all moved through the same regions without breaking the pattern. Dr. Mills noted something that would later be repeated in reports with caution. Feeding intensity was not increasing under overlap conditions. It was stabilizing. Instead of conflict, there was distribution. Instead of fragmentation, there was persistence of spacing. The acoustic field mirrored it. Hydrophone channels, which normally produced layered chaos during feeding events, had flattened into structured pulses. Still complex, still layered, but no longer disordered. It was not communication in the usual sense. It behaved more like a system maintaining constraints rather than exchanging messages. When all datasets were finally combined, drone imagery, sonar mapping, hydrophone records, the outcome was consistent enough that interpretation became unavoidable even without agreement on cause. Movement density peaks were repeating at stable spatial intervals across the region. Not rigid, not geometric, but persistent enough to hold across shifting environmental conditions. Kaplan distribution still played a role, but it no longer acted as the sole driver. Instead, prey seemed to reinforce positions that already existed within whale movement patterns. That inversion was the point where the language in the logs shifted, carefully at first, toward something less defined. Ecological linkage was the phrase that eventually appeared in the summary draft. Not coordination, not synchronization, linkage. The distinction mattered because nothing about the physical environment had changed. Temperature remained within the expected seasonal range. Salinity readings were stable. There were no unusual plankton blooms, no thermal anomalies, no external forcing events that could account for the behavior. What had changed was the relationship between moving systems inside the environment. By the time the vessel began preparing to leave the station, the ocean had already returned to its normal appearance. Flat again. Ordinary again. The kind of ordinariness that makes people doubt what they just witnessed because it leaves no permanent mark behind. But the datasets did not return to normal. And long after the drones were recovered and the hydrophones lifted, Dr. Mills stayed at the console longer than necessary, replaying one narrow segment of footage where 3 fin whales surfaced in sequence across a line that did not exist on any chart, at intervals that matched nothing known, as if the ocean had briefly revealed a structure it was never meant to expose, and then closed it again without warning.